Everyone can hear me okay, right? Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me here today, Liz, and to the entire Prosper team. It's awesome to be part of this event. I'm really glad that we're amplifying the spotlight on this issue. I do think it's critically important, and I think we're going to find that in our data here today. I also want to highlight the morning's been awesome so far. Just all the presenters and information that we've seen already from Rob, Ray, and Fiona, and Andrew has been just fantastic. I'm definitely a bit of a data geek, so some of those scatter plots you could have left up there for a few more minutes to really internalize, but those were rich. That was truly fantastic. I also wanted to talk a little bit about my own story and kind of how I came to be on the stage today, because really what I heard from folks like Rob, yourself in particular, started to ring a chord for me. So where did my journey come from? Well, I was pretty lucky 12 years ago to start at Capital One. It was a good job with friendly people, but I knew absolutely nothing about credit cards. In fact, at that point, I had used one once, and it was because I did not know how to budget or plan. And essentially what had happened was I ran out of money at the end of my university education like 3 or 4 weeks before I was going to graduate. So I made it miraculously without budgeting, 3 years, 11 months, some number of days, and then I just hit empty at the grocery store. And my mother had given me an emergency card, which she told me not to use unless it was really an emergency. The milk seemed like an emergency. So I put it in there, it worked, and my financial duress was really short-lived, to be perfectly honest. But I was a little bit embarrassed, and I felt a little bit less independent than I did the day before, and that moment stuck with me a little bit. And so when I landed at Capital One, actually, my first kind of role there was in helping the company identify credit card applicants who are likely to pay us back versus those who are less likely to pay us back, a pretty important facet in our business. But to be honest, I was surprised by that, and I naively asked, some people don't pay us back. I didn't realize that was part of the business, and kind of with the privilege I had, that was surprising to me. So, and I asked why, and that was a hard thing to answer. People couldn't answer me why. They could just tell me who exhibited certain characteristics that were indicative of risky behavior and who did not. But could anyone answer the question why? No, they couldn't. And I still wrestle with that question today, and so I wanted to talk through that a little bit. And I'm happy to work for a company that is happy to support the cause here. And in our efforts to do so, we were happy to conduct this research study, and I think Derek's going to cover a lot of the ins and outs of it too, from what TD uncovered, and that kind of report that's in your packages is awesome if you haven't leafed through it. But let me get started. I want to cover 3 points today. One is that income and expense volatility do exist in Canada. In fact, the majority of us experience it in some way. Second, that income and expense volatility is leading to financial stress, which in fact is impacting our day-to-day lives. And third, a little bit more nebulous, but it does look like people are still remaining optimistic about their personal finances. And although I can't prove it in our data, I hypothesize to our detriment. So I wanted to discuss that a little bit. But let's start with the basics here. So, are we experiencing income volatility? We asked a simple question: to what extent does your household income vary, fluctuate month to month? And we asked this literally in February, and we found that roughly 50% of people experience some fluctuation, with somewhere around 20% probably experiencing a very meaningful amount of fluctuation in their income. Next, we asked, how much expense volatility are you experiencing? So, can you describe how much your expenses are changing from month to month? We didn't specifically quantify it, and most people did gravitate towards kind of the middle answer of, they're roughly the same most months, but unusually high or low in some months. And others, stated that actually it does just vary a ton from month to month. I mean, these 2 data points alone should be concerning for us. I think it was last year sometime, there was a study released by the Canadian Payrolls Association that suggested 50% of Canadians, roughly 50%, I think 47 was probably their exact number, would be in a pinch if their paycheck was delayed by just 1 week. So that's pretty striking. All right, next point. We wanted to figure out, based on what we were observing in terms of expense volatility, how often do you need to borrow to cover for an unplanned emergency expense? And this was also a striking data point. Almost 2 in 5 of our responders said, yeah, at some point in the last 12 months, I've had to borrow money to fund an unplanned expense. And about 10% had to do that 3 or more times, which is just striking. We did ask people, what was the source of that? And I think it was, what you might expect. Almost half of the cases were from unplanned home or auto expenses, but also helping out your family was a big part of it too, and unplanned medical. Kind of not included in the data here, but worth noting, we did ask how much do these unplanned expenses tend to be for, and about 3/4 of our responders said it was for less than $2,000, which I thought was positive. Potentially, if the expenses are unplanned for but low enough, we're able to fund those through savings or emergency funds that we might have on hand. So we next asked the question, for the most recent unplanned expense that you had, how did you go about funding that? And the bar in gray is kind of if you will, the positive data point in the sense that roughly 20% of people were able to fund them through the use of their savings, but 35% of people were funding it through a credit card. And there was another population of folks, roughly 1/3, who were getting it from friends or family. But as we discussed in kind of the last data point, friends and family are also a source of unplanned expenses for individuals. So it's, on the one hand, that's a good thing. There's a bit of a group kind of insurance effect happening there. On the other hand, your lives are intertwined with others, and if your friends or family aren't planning for their spending, it could be impacting you as well. And the home equity line of credit. So are people pulling money out of their homes? That is certainly fairly prevalent in Canada, although that has been shrinking with kind of tightening regulations on that front too. And 10% from payday loans, which I imagine if we started conducting this study year over year, that would be an interesting one to track how much that's growing over time. So I think the source of this we all know, but just wanted to kind of double down on it. People are experiencing income volatility, they're experiencing expense volatility, and they're having to fund that with borrowing. That is basically a symptom of the fact that many of us don't have at our disposal multiple months of funds saved up to cover life's expenses. So, 28% of our respondents did say I have 6 months or more of emergency savings at my disposal for living expenses, but the vast majority have less than that. In fact, many just have simply 1 or 2 months. And I think there's similar data points coming from others. Here's where things got a little bit scary for me, to be perfectly honest. So we asked people how many times in the last year have you had to skip some of the basic expenses in life? And the way to read this is that if you're in the blue bars, you skipped this type of payment once. If you're in the green bar, you skip this type of payment 2 times. And if you're in the red bar, you skip this type of payment 3 times. Keep in mind the timing of this study, which I think is critically important, Liz, you mentioned. This is over the last 12 months. We did this today. And the environment we live in today is one where unemployment is low and credit is available. So even in that construct, we found that 1/4 of our respondents had delayed buying groceries or food in the last year. I don't know I don't know what would happen to that data point in the event of a recession. I can tell you that in our world of consumer finance, we see during a typical recession that the rates at which people are not paying us back roughly double. So if 20% of people are skipping a credit card bill, that might look like something like 40%. I certainly shudder to think what that could mean for people.
Are these conditional or not? Like conditional on having a credit card?
Not conditional. And in the Canadian context, far more than the US, people would be A, banked. So I think something like 98% or 99% of our adult population is banked, and the vast majority of adult Canadians also have a credit card. Many multiple. I think for, say, the student loan as an example, 50% of our respondents said that this wasn't applicable to them, so you can infer they didn't have a student loan. So 11 on 50 be the math there. All right, so I had also suggested that this income and expense volatility was negatively impacting people's lives. And we did attempt to validate that by asking people, how often are finances a source of stress for you? And again, a pretty stark statistic, I think, for us to stare at, in that 70-ish% of our people suggested that it is at least some of the time. Potentially most alarming is that 40% said often or more. I didn't show the data here. We did do some generational cuts on it, but our sample sizes aren't huge. This was over a similar statistic, often or more, was up over 50% for the millennial cohort. All right, more bad news, guys. Sorry, I can feel the energy just dwindling a little bit. I guess I can't make it. I'm just trying to present the facts here. In the past 12 months, has your financial circumstances negatively impacted any of the following? So, I mean, this is certainly a striking number to stare at, with almost 40% suggesting that it had impacted their mental well-being, over a quarter physical well-being. It is no wonder that if those two are impacted in some way, your family, personal, or work life will also be impacted. Okay, the last maybe set of data points I wanted to touch on was this element of staying positive. And it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I mean, I must say, it's if you're not optimistic about the future, it might be difficult to realize a positive future, but I think we need to be realistic about the present as well. So we asked our survey respondents, do you expect your income to go up or stay the same, or possibly go down? The vast majority said that it will stay the same or go up, and to be honest, a lot of those people are in the stay the same category, but there was more people on the upper end than the lower end. And people are also expecting their expenses to not get any worse over the next 12 months, so to actually stay the same or go down. So for the most part, people are expecting that things are going to get better over time, at least from a financial perspective. And the impact of that seems to be that people aren't consistently following a plan or budget. So although some people might say that they sometimes follow a plan or budget, I'm not sure that sometimes will cut it, particularly as we know that when times are tough, we're less likely to want to do that sort of activity. And we found that almost 6 out of 10 of our responders were not consistently following a plan or a budget, similar to myself in my university days, which is why I ran out, to be perfectly honest. So I just wanted to conclude, just with one last thought, and I'm so glad that, Rob, you in particular were here, because I think the answer lies in going a little bit deeper. In my career, I've learned a lot about the characteristics of people who are likely to pay us back versus not, and it's been much harder to get to the why. But in that journey, vast majority of the time, we find out that people are well-intentioned and lack the means to do so, and those means are attached to very personal circumstances. So I actually think that's the challenge here for this group. The true insight will come from learning about those individual cases. And we're going to need to spend some time getting to know individual stories and people to really be able to put the why behind what is very, in my opinion, a very clear and apparent, case for needing to do something on this front. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. That was brilliant.